Hey guys, I appreciate you watching this video. We're going to look at an article, great article. I'll put a link in the description or in the comments. The title of the article is Debt Collectors Have Made a Fortune This Year. Now They're Coming for More. And my name is John Watts. I'm a consumer protection lawyer. And this really answers some questions that a lot of people have. So we've all been going through this pandemic. We've seen the damage done to the economy. And the question is, how are these debt collectors doing? How are these debt buyers doing? And I'll tell you, in general, debt collection is sort of an anti-recession business. So when the economy's in recession, those tend to be the better years for the debt collectors. Now, it is true that each individual dollar that they try and collect may be a little bit harder to get because people don't have extra money. Although we'll see in this article that's been a little bit distorted with some of the stimulus efforts of the government. But there's a bigger supply of defaulted debt. And so it's just supply and demand. When there's a bigger supply, then the price goes down to buy that debt. So now these companies, at least the debt buyers, are able to buy up cheaper debt and then try and collect it. So fantastic article by these two journalists, and you'll see their information at the bottom of this article. So let's look at Encore Capital. Now, that's not a name that we often think of. Encore is Midland Credit Management, Midland Funding, Asset Acceptance, but mainly Midland Credit, Midland Funding. So we have here, they are the largest debt buyer in the country, and they have doubled their previous record for earnings in a quarter. That's in the middle of a global pandemic, okay? So this article suggests it's really the CARES Act, because what we have is there have been stimulus checks, and then we've also passed laws that say we're going to slow down or halt foreclosures, evictions. And so there's more money available, but there's no prohibition on collecting old credit card debts. And that is Encore. Again, Midland Credit, Midland Funding, that's their specialty. So there's a lot of spending that's cut, and this article says finding themselves with enough money to settle owed debts, people responded to calls and letters. And look at this, debt buying executives couldn't help marveling at their good fortune. And so here's the CEO of Portfolio Recovery. And that is not the biggest debt buyer, but I think it's the second biggest debt buyer. I mean, I just give you an idea. They filed just dozens and dozens and dozens of lawsuits a week just in Alabama. And so they say, or this CEO said that it's a perfect storm from a cash perspective. And so the analysts on Wall Street say, here's what we think going back to Encore. They're going to blow past $200 million in profit this year, reward stockholders 40% earnings. And then portfolio is very similar. And the share price of both have soared off their early April lows. And of course, we remember when COVID really first hit, the stock market took a pretty sharp tumble. And that included these stocks, but now they have come roaring back. So we did a video on this. I think it's something like the CFPB strikes again, where the CFPB sued Encore. And this article points out that investors didn't really care. Now, the CFPB said, hey, you broke this consent agreement in 2015. You did false statements. You had robo-signed documents. And Encore says, it's unnecessary because we fixed all those problems years ago. What's funny is every time these guys get sued, every time the government takes any action, they're like, oh, that's yesterday's news. It's not a problem anymore. We fixed all that. There's really no need to sue us because we're doing everything perfect now. That's what they always say. And look, if you're watching this video in 2025, I'm sure the CFPB will have sued them again. And again, they'll say, oh, that's all back in like 2020, no problem now. So this article points out that the only real bad news was some of the courts were shut down. And notice how important debt collection lawsuits are. It's a key source of revenue for the companies, a way to extract payment from consumers, typically low income, who don't offer it up. So the debt buyers send letters, they call, you don't pay, so then they sue you. And this is pointing out, but even now that hiccup is over. And I'll tell you this, in Alabama, there was never a shutdown. Okay, a lot of states said, hey, we're going to extend the statute of limitation. We're going to shut things down for months. We didn't do that in Alabama. So there's really no dip in the number of debt buyer cases. Now, certainly original creditor case, there was a big dip in those, but not the debt buyer cases. So this points out that Encore and debt buyers are back at it, filing suits by the thousands every week. And so here we have in August, and we'll just look at a couple of areas. So they filed 1,000 suits in Indiana in 4 weeks and 2,000 suits in Metro Atlanta. So think about that. One city, granted, it's a huge city, but one city, 2,000 lawsuits in August. That's 500 a week being filed, 500 people being sued by Midland Funding. And so here we have Chicago Portfolio Recovery filed 3,000 suits in July. So what's that, 750 a week? LVNV filed over 2,700 suits in Maryland in August. And so all of these numbers are up. And I can tell you in Alabama, again, there was no slowdown, but they are certainly filing more cases than they were last year. And of course, the companies say, hey, look, we're working with everybody. We only sue as a last resort. To say that is, wishful thinking or a fantasy, it's just absurd. Some of these companies don't even reach out before they sue you. They just sue you. And so this idea that, we're working with you and last resort, that's a bunch of garbage. Okay, so here's Portfolio Recovery. And they said, we had a little prohibition about taking wages and things like that. I can tell you it didn't stop the lawsuits, though. And here's an Encore executive saying, we have consistently and proactively communicated. Don't you love when people use all these words? Consistently, proactively communicated about the various relief options, blah, blah, blah. Okay. So they say we're not seizing bank accounts, but we are seizing wages. And again, it did not slow them down on filing lawsuits one bit. Okay. And so if Congress doesn't pass any additional stimulus, then unemployment will likely remain high. So what does that mean? That means there's more credit card that's defaulted, which means the banks will sell those. And so we've got people falling behind. This is where confusion comes in. People will say to me, well, aren't these debt buyers going to go out of business because they don't have, they're trying to collect money from people who don't have anything. Well, again, it's supply and demand. They're going to pick it up at a low price. And if they get a judgment, that judgment grows. And in Alabama, it's good for 10 years. Really, they can extend it for another 10. So for 20 years, that thing can grow. It doubles and doubles and doubles. And they play the long game. Eventually you're going to get a job. We'll garnish your wages. Hey, you'll put a few dollars in a bank account. We'll take that. Hey, you'll get your house. We'll put a lien on your house. So let's see what the article says. Even that scenario turns out to be rosy for the debt buyers. So while good times can mean Encore collects on more debt than expected, bad times typically bring a glut of people suffering under loans they cannot repay. So they can scoop up raw materials, which are the defaulted accounts, more cheaply. So here's what Encore, again, just think Midland, what they say to Wall Street in their security filings. The company is particularly excited about the prospects for increased supply in the future. So they're saying this is fabulous. There's going to be more and more people defaulting on debt. And so these banks are going to sell it. So we'll be able to get it cheaper. Okay. Now, here's something from Elizabeth Warren. Obviously, she has a political perspective. She has a bias that is favorable toward consumers, not so favorable toward credit card companies and some of these debt buyers. And she says these same debt buyers known for fighting consumer protection laws have been raking in the cash. They're now, let me just highlight this. They're now licking their chops in anticipation of profiting even more off families who have Their hours further cut, can't find a job, can't keep up with their bills, it's disgraceful. And so again, that's her perspective. And it certainly has her slant on it, but factually she's correct. Okay. Whether you think that's a good thing or a bad thing, she is factually correct that they are buying up more debt and they're going to be able to go after consumers. So typically in a year, Midland Funding, Midland Credit Management will buy 2 to 3 million accounts, and they typically pay 8.6 cents on the dollar. So if an account's sort of a, oddly precise number, but $3,142, they'll pay 271. So how do they make money on that? Well, as this puts it, they pursue debtors in near perpetuity. Yeah, basically forever. So they're still collecting tens of millions of dollars each year from debts it bought in 2009. So remember what I said about a judgment in Alabama is good for 10 years. And it's growing, getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And then at the 10-year mark, if it still hasn't been fully collected with all the new interest, they can renew it almost guaranteed for another 10 years. And so they buy a debt and they have maybe 3 years from the date of default, or 6 years, 4 years, depending on the state. That's statute of limitation to file. But once they file, it might take 2 months or 2 years to get to judgment. And then from judgment, they might have 20 years. So they play the long game here. They buy the debt cheap. And it's almost like farming. You go plant the seeds, and then you say, one day there'll be the harvest time. And so this points out the key is the courts. So let me just get this highlighted. Debt buyers have flooded local courts nationwide with suits, account for more than a quarter of all debt collection cases. And I'll just tell you, in Alabama, Midland and Portfolio, and let's say LVNV, those would account for well over half of all collection cases, including original creditors. So Capital One files a bunch of lawsuits, but they don't compare with Portfolio and Midland and those guys, particularly when you add them up. So this says, talking about original creditors, so that would be like Citibank, Chase, Capital One, Synchrony Bank, have mostly opted to suspend filing new suits. So normal times, Capital One files more lawsuits, similar to Encore and Portfolio, and that's true in Alabama. Capital One largely stopped filing new suits. We're just now seeing in Alabama some companies filing. Let's see. This article points out Citigroup resumed filing in July. We're seeing that, and we are seeing some others start to file, but it's primarily the debt buyers and then a few original creditors. So Citibank, of course, says that they have special assistance and that's not seeking to garnish the bank accounts. And so that's nice to know. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's what they say. And then now, as a good article does, it'll now give us some examples here of sort of real people. So here's somebody from Brooklyn, Encore, so Midland Funding, Midland Credit sued. This was Care Credit, issued by Synchrony Bank, and that's who Encore said that they bought it. So this particular person says, well, I know I should go answer, but I didn't want to go in the courthouse. I'm not sure what to do. And here's somebody, legal director, saying that there's just a lot of confusion. Courts are coming back online, but what's happening? And so I'll give you an example from Alabama. So the court of Mobile, Alabama, which is on the coast, the city of Mobile. So it's a county of Mobile also. It's in kind of it's a government building, but it almost looks like a high-rise building, and a beautiful courtroom and everything. And to get there, you walk in this huge ground floor place, and there's all these different government services there. And you go to the elevator to go up to the court, sort of the courthouse, if you think about it that way. Well, unless you have a court date, you can't go up there. The deputy stops you. Now, if you're a lawyer and you say, hey, I'm here for court, they let you go up. But if you're doing this on your own, You say, hey, I want to go up to the clerk's office. They're like, no, no, no. You just put something in that box over there. And somebody will come down from the clerk's office and get it. Now, at least that's how it was happening one time I was there. Maybe it's still happening that way. But my point is there's confusion. So I've been in courts in the last 6 weeks where we have 40 or 50 people packed into a courtroom. It's just like business like normal. In other courts, you go, you sign in, and then you go sit in your car, and then the judge calls you on your cell phone and says, okay, now you can come in the courthouse. So there's a lot of confusion. Are we doing this virtual? Are we doing this in person? And so that's what this particular person, Susan Shin, is talking about. So this person was able to respond by mail, and she says, look, I don't have much time to worry about it because I'm trying to figure out what to do. I'm working. I'm I'm trying to do Zoom for all these kids. And so it's very difficult. And this is just a very accurate statement for a lot of people. It's just crazy to me they're filing all this during this time when there's so much going on. Now, this paragraph points out who predominantly gets sued. And of course, people from all walks of life get sued for defaulted debt. But it's mainly people income under 40,000. It's going to be more common in mostly Black neighborhoods. These suits result in judgments. Okay. And we've talked about that before. Your biggest danger when you're sued is doing nothing and they get a default judgment. Because then when they get that judgment, like we see here, then that allows garnishment, which means taking your bank account, taking in Alabama, basically 25% of your take home pay. And so look at this number here. 4 million people have their wages garnished each year in our country. That's a pretty massive number of people. That's not counting the people that have a judgment and they have enough in their bank that gets wiped out and it takes care of the judgment. And in most states, this is true in Alabama, can seize up to a quarter of a worker's take-home pay or clean out their bank account. And that might actually should be an and there, because in most states, they can seize your wages and seize your bank account. And so what happens when state legislatures have tried to protect funds from being garnished? And so we'll look at what this talks about. Then I'll tell you about something that happened in Alabama recently. So they point out Encore, again, Midland Funding, Midland Credit Management, has been there to oppose it. So here's a Connecticut bill. This is to protect up to $1,000 in a bank account. And they say, Encore says, hey, we typically are collecting $700, so we're not able to use bank garnishment. So the bill dies, okay? In California, they fought against something that would protect about $1,700. And here's what this Ted Merman, who's a professor, says. You got to think, why? Who on earth thinks it's a good idea to take someone's last dollar? The only people who do this are debt collectors who have no ongoing relationship. In other words, it's not the banks doing this. That's part of why they sell off the debt, because they really don't want to be crossways with their customers. They want you to come back, get your mortgage through them, or put money in the bank account or savings account or CD. And so here in Washington, we have another situation. So they try to protect from wage garnishment. So earnings above 217 are eligible to be seized. And then Washington passed a bill that said, well, let's take into account that our minimum wage is $13.50 and the federal minimum wage is much smaller than that. So that would be $472. And Encore argued against it. People earning that much shouldn't be completely exempt from garnishment because, you're just fabulously wealthy if you're making $472. And I'll tell you, in Alabama, there was a big battle over garnishment of wages. And can you protect your wages? Can you protect your bank account? And there was some confusion over this, and the legislature passed a law that basically hurt consumers. And then the court came along and said, hey, that's unconstitutional because our Alabama Constitution says you can protect a certain amount of your wages. Okay. And I won't get into all the details, but I mean, these collection folks were just fighting like the devil against that. And some great lawyers were fighting against it. And they asked me to help write what's called an amicus brief. So that's what's called a friend of the court. So I represented some sort of advocacy groups that were there to help consumers and low income folks. And so we argued against uh, these attacks on this law, and said no, the Constitution, the Alabama Constitution, makes it very clear that this is what we're entitled to protect. And the court ruled in our favor, so that's good. But it just goes to show you that, I mean, they will fight any protection of money or wages. And so here's what Encore says, and this is what I'm talking about, what we did. So generally argues consumers should have to file exemptions in court, and those often exist, but they're rarely invoked. They don't know about them. They don't understand the process. I mean, fortunately, the client that got this great ruling went to a really talented legal aid group in Alabama, and they were able to help to fight this and protect or claim this exemption. And so, Midland Funding, Midland Credit Management, they're saying, oh, you got to sort of navigate these complicated exemptions, and that's the only way you can protect your money. So, here we have an example of somebody in Florida, and so Florida has some interesting rules. The wages of anyone deemed head of household, and that can protect you. But Encore gets a judgment, and this particular person didn't know that he qualified for this exemption. So they start taking a quarter of his wages, and this thing just balloons up with interest and court costs and all these things. And so this guy says, look, I had to cancel my insurance, my health insurance, so I could make these payments because money is being garnished from his check. And then where he worked ran into problems, with COVID and all that sort of stuff. So he says, look, they're just ruthless about it. I'd hate to see that happen to anybody. And then we have, as we get towards the end of this, the article points out that a lot of times these collection suits have a lasting negative effect because you may pay money and then that causes you fall behind or end up in foreclosure or do bankruptcy. And this is one reason why we suggest people really look at fighting these lawsuits. It's not the right decision for everybody, but it's something to look at. Or even if you settle, to settle in a way where you're not paying any money to these people. Okay. And that's something to look at before you do bankruptcy or before you just pay them all the money that you have. And the article points out that even in good times for low income consumers, they're kind of living on the edge. And so the stimulus from the CARES Act was very helpful. So, I mean, extra $600 for unemployment, got $1,200 stimulus checks. And so in July, most people, or I should say a higher percentage of people, had an additional sort of cushion of cash. But who benefited from that? Well, debt collectors. So about 25% of people use that extra money to pay down debts. Now, this doesn't tell us whether it's sort of existing credit card debt or if this is old debt, but there are some negative consequences to paying down this old charged off debt. Normally, those debts are not growing with interest. There's a few exceptions, but normally they just sort of stay stagnant until they get a judgment. Then they grow with interest. So this particular person, Felipe Severino, a business professor, said, I don't think it's very good use of their money. And, his point is, if in a perfect world, you would not be spending your very limited funds on old charged off debt. Okay. Now, if you're facing a lawsuit, now you have to make some decisions. Okay. And he said, look, the whole point of this extra money going into the economy is so that it would be spent. And so you go to your local store, you go to a local business, and you're pumping money into the economy, but that doesn't happen when money goes to the debt collectors. And so here we have kind of towards the end of this, the flood of government aid, sudden contraction in spending led to an unpredictable economy. Unemployment shot up, but we don't have all these delinquencies, bankruptcies, foreclosures. But now that's coming. Unless the government steps in again, that will be coming. And notice what Encore says here. Our liquidity puts us in a strong position to capture the substantial purchasing opportunity, which we believe is sure to follow. So he's saying, look, all the cash we have, I mean, we know there's a huge purchasing opportunity coming, and we're in a position to really capitalize on that. So here are the two authors of this. We got Paul and Jeff. I'll put the link either in the description or in a comment. Fabulous article. Read it yourself. I just wanted to go over it. I thought it was very well done, very insightful, and I hope you found this helpful. Okay, I'll catch you in the next video. Thanks, guys. Bye.